Whatever strange things I noticed following me, I also saw at my father's house after moving in with him, but that's another story. These days, when I visit my mom's house, I don't feel that creepy sensation or any bad vibes. However, my father's home still has that heavy, unsettling energy, especially in the basement. The man who never left this story happened to a friend of mine, and to this day, it gives him chills every time he talks about it. Through this tale, we're taken to a distant, beautiful place. For privacy's sake, I won't mention the exact name of the town, but it's a small, well-known village in Italy. My friend used to visit it often and still does. This strange encounter happened around 12 years ago during a summer when my friend, Dee, was just a carefree child, enjoying life like all kids his age. Every summer, when school was out, Dee and his parents would visit his grandmother, who lived alone in a modest but respectable house on the outskirts of the village. Having visited the village many times before, Dee had made fast friends with the local kids, especially one boy in particular, whom I'll call T. Dee and T spent most of the summer together, playing around the town square, pulling pranks on the locals, and making memories like every child does during those peaceful months. However, one memory stands out not because it was fun, but because it remains unexplained. Roughly 90 years ago, during the first winter of Italy's involvement in World War II, a terrible event took place in the area. The invading army devastated several nearby towns, killing residents and burning homes as they moved closer to this particular village. On December 12, 1944, the soldiers gathered the townspeople into the local school, separating the women and children from the men and boys over the age of 11. In a cruel twist, the men and older boys were taken to a nearby hill and executed. Nearly 400 people killed in moments. A few managed to survive by feigning death or escaping. The invaders then set fire to the village, destroying nearly everything, including the school. Miraculously, the women and children survived the flames. After the attack, the survivors were left to bury their dead and rebuild their lives. It's no surprise that such an event left a mark on the village. After the war, a memorial was erected on the hill where the massacre occurred. It became a peaceful spot that Dee visited often. The hill, surrounded by greenery and offering a view of the village, seemed serene. Dee, like many children in the village, was allowed to roam freely, and during the final days of his summer visit, he and T decided to visit the hill at night. The monument, known as the Rest, was always open to the public. Dee's parents weren't strict, so curfew wasn't an issue, and T, though cautious of his parents, managed to sneak out easily. As the two walked toward the hill under the night sky, Dee felt a sense of adventure, but as soon as they reached the top, the atmosphere shifted. The fun, carefree feeling evaporated. The silence stretched, and Dee began to feel uneasy, as if they weren't alone. The tragedy that took place on the hill wasn't new to Dee. His grandmother had told him about it many times. Though the memory of the massacre weighed on his mind, he had never felt uncomfortable there, until now. Suddenly, T froze and whispered, "What are you looking at?" Dee turned to see what had caught his friend's attention, and there, walking slowly towards them, was a man. He looked ordinary but wore an outdated hat that reminded Dee of something his grandfather used to wear. The boys stood still, watching as the man approached. He didn't seem aggressive, just out of place. Dee's thoughts raced, but before he could process them, T yelled, "Run!" Grabbing Dee's arm, they bolted down the hill, running blindly, barely avoiding stumbling. At the base of the hill, they stopped and looked back. The man hadn't followed them. "Who was that?" T asked, his voice trembling. Dee didn't know. They caught their breath, and T, regaining his usual confidence, asked, "Do you think we saw a ghost?" Dee wasn't sure. The man had seemed too real. The next day, T, undeterred by the previous night, suggested they go back. "Maybe he's just a caretaker," T reasoned. Dee was skeptical but agreed. That night, they returned to the hill. Sure enough, the man was there again, sitting quietly, staring off into the distance. This time, T bravely approached and asked, "Do you work here?" The man turned and answered, "I've worked everywhere around here." The boys were puzzled. Something about the man's tone unsettled them. D whispered to T, "We should leave." But before they could go, T asked, "Are you always here?" The man replied, "I need to get back to my family soon." D's heart raced. Something felt wrong. They backed away slowly and left the hill as quickly as they could without running. The next morning, D told his grandmother about their strange encounter. Her face grew serious. "There's no caretaker up there," she said. "No one would be on that hill at night." D realized then that the man they had seen wasn't alive. The men killed 90 years ago had left behind families, homes, and lives unfinished. It made sense that their spirits might still wander the hill. A few days later, D left the village to start another school year, but he never forgot the man on the hill, the man who never left. Ever since those 3 strange events, I haven't seen or heard anything, but the memory of them still fills me with anxiety and a deep unease. I keep telling myself there's no way anything like that could exist in my quiet seaside town, but a small part of me wonders if it could. This is about my ex and the eerie events tied to him. I should mention that the story touches on sensitive subjects like domestic violence, assault, and harm to animals. I'm sorry for how long this is, but the details are important for it to make sense. I'm a 21-year-old woman, and when I was 19, I had just ended a relationship that lasted over 3 years. Being young and not really understanding relationships, I jumped back into dating quickly, and soon I met my ex. At first, he seemed perfect. He had a stable job, liked my alternative style, and even seemed to enjoy doing things with me. I know it's basic, but I had never had that before, so I fell for it. He was 23, and for the sake of the story, let's call him Eric. Our relationship progressed fast, and I visited his place early on. That's when things started to get strange. I've always been spiritual and had paranormal experiences growing up. My childhood home had a weird atmosphere, though my mom would never admit it. So I was used to unusual feelings, but when I first stepped into Eric's house, it felt different, heavy, unsettling. I thought it was just nerves, but that explanation didn't hold for long. Things would frequently move around the house, and I would always get blamed for it. Missing items, things ending up under the furniture, objects moved from one room to another. I sometimes thought the dog was responsible, but how would that explain things winding up in places like under the couch or inside the dishwasher? Over time, I noticed that the hallway outside Eric's room was much colder than the rest of the house. It gave me such a strong feeling of dread that I would run past it. I'd catch glimpses of shadows standing still or something peeking from around the corner. This became even more obvious when I was home alone. The dog would stick close to me, growling and barking at seemingly nothing just outside the door. It was like she was protecting me. Eventually, I began to shut the door, which helped a little, but she never fully relaxed. If Eric saw the dog acting this way, he'd hit or push her away, yelling for her to be quiet, but I was never convinced that there was nothing there. I brought it up to his mom once, and she told me she believed his grandparents' spirits were in the house. She'd had similar experiences and assured me they weren't harmful. That eased my mind for a while, but soon things got much worse. As time passed, I started having terrifying nightmares while staying there. Dreams where something was harming my nephew or niece, or of being watched. I started experiencing sleep paralysis, which hadn't happened in years. The intensity of these experiences seemed to match the rise in abuse I was enduring. One night, during one of the worst times, I was jolted awake by something grabbing me. It yanked me so hard that it left marks on my arm. It felt like it was trying to pull me out of bed. I woke up crying, scared out of my mind, I shook Eric awake, but he just yelled at me to go back to sleep, calling me stupid. Eventually, I calmed down and fell back asleep, but I woke up again a little while later. This time, I saw something terrifying. Standing beside Eric's side of the bed was a figure, an unnaturally tall man in old-fashioned clothes, like a suit with a bowler hat. His arms hung low, past his knees with bony, long fingers. He stood there staring at me before slowly reaching out. I scrambled back, trying to get away, but I could feel his fingers brush against my arm. I started screaming, crying uncontrollably, but he just loomed closer. Finally, Eric woke up and turned on the light, and the figure disappeared. It felt like whatever it was wanted me out of the house. After that, I couldn't sleep without the light on. Not long after, Eric sexually assaulted me. I left soon after, got a restraining order, and he was convicted. It was an incredibly traumatic time. Since then, I've never seen that figure again. No nightmares, no feelings of dread, nothing. The relationship with Eric lasted just under 6 months, during which I went through severe emotional, physical, and sexual abuse. He isolated me from my family, gaslighted me, and stalked me relentlessly after I left. I still don't have an answer for what happened to me in that house. But looking back, I wonder if whatever was there wasn't trying to hurt me, but trying to push me away to save me from the abuse I would endure. Maybe it knew I had to leave, and fear was the only way it could make me go. When I was around 11 years old, my family arranged a 4-day stay at a log cabin nestled deep in Oregon. We went with my grandmother. What happened there would leave an unforgettable mark on me. I stepped out of the car, the cool breeze brushing my face as I gazed at the thick forest surrounding us. Heading towards the cabin, my mom called, "Eric, sweetie, go ahead and unpack in your room." I pushed open the cabin door, startled by the loud creak it made. Inside, there was a spacious living room, a couch placed in front of a large TV, and a kitchen attached to it with a row of bar stools lined up at the counter. I went up the stairs, past a small bathroom, and walked down the hallway to find my room. As I opened the door, I let out a scream. There, in the middle of the floor, was a dead mouse, its body mangled with its insides scattered across the floor. I raced back downstairs to see my dad pushing my grandma's wheelchair into the cabin. "Dad, there's a dead mouse in my room," I yelled. "You're old enough to clean it up, aren't you?" he replied. Reluctantly, I grabbed a roll of paper towels and a can of disinfectant spray, and I did the unpleasant task. Around 6 p.m., my mom made mac and cheese with hot dogs, my favorite meal at the time. As I walked over to the couch with my bowl, I noticed something strange. There was a trapdoor right in the center of the living room. "Mom, what's this?" I asked. "Probably access to the crawl space under the house," she responded casually. Satisfied, I sat down and turned on the TV. The food was delicious, and before long, it was time for bed. My dad had mentioned fishing and canoeing the next day, so I was eager to fall asleep. I woke up in the middle of the night to a faint shuffling noise. I got out of bed, left the door ajar, and peeked down the dim hallway, where only the moonlight cast shadows. I heard the sound again and followed it downstairs, putting my ear to the floor. The noises were coming from under the house. Fear washed over me, but curiosity got the best of me. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously opened the trapdoor. As I climbed down into the crawl space, a dozen mice scurried away. The space beneath the cabin was cold and vast, like a maze. I crawled deeper into the shadows, unsure if I was being brave or just foolish. After crawling for a while, I noticed movement about 10 feet ahead of me. I shined my flashlight towards it and froze. A hunched figure with long, pale arms stared back at me. Its eyes glowed white in the beam of my light. The creature let out a piercing screech, clearly startled by the light. Without hesitation, I turned and began crawling as fast as I could toward the trapdoor. I glanced back only once to see the thing rapidly following me, its long fingers wrapping around beams as it moved. I could only imagine it had been feeding on the mice, and what I found in my room earlier had been its leftovers. The thought of what it could do to me filled me with terror. The crawl seemed to go on forever, and with each passing second, the creature got closer. Just when I thought I was lost, I saw the trapdoor ahead. I scrambled out as quickly as I could, feeling its breath behind me. I slammed the door shut and threw my weight onto it, my heart pounding as the thing scratched and pushed from below. After a few minutes, the noises stopped, but I ran to my parents' room, pounding on the door and yelling for help. My dad opened the door, confused and half asleep. "Dad, there's something under the house trying to get in," I shouted. He didn't believe me, thinking it was just a nightmare, and sent me back to bed. Needless to say, I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I joined my dad for fishing on the lake. Although I didn't catch any fish, I was just glad to be outside, far away from the cabin and the horror of the previous night. Later, we roasted marshmallows by the campfire. It was a nice distraction, but I couldn't shake the fear that lingered in my mind. That night, as I lay in bed again, I heard it, the creaking sound of the trapdoor opening. My heart sank. Then, the sound of cupboards in the kitchen opening and slamming shut filled the cabin. I could hear the thing's footsteps moving around, and my door handle jiggled. I held my breath, praying it wouldn't come in. Suddenly, I heard my dad shout, "Get out of here!" followed by a loud, eerie screech and the sound of glass shattering. I rushed out of my room to find my dad standing outside his door, holding a knife, with a trail of blood leading to the broken window. That was the last time we ever stayed in that cabin. Years later, after sharing summers and making countless memories, Kay even revisited the cross monument a few times, always remembering to pause for a moment of reflection. Since that first visit, Kay has kept a habit of offering a quiet thought for those who are gone and those who remain. Grandma's house. I have two stories about my grandmother's house that had a strange, eerie atmosphere. These memories involve my cousin Haley and myself. Sadly, Haley passed away in a tragic car accident in 2013, so she'll never hear these stories again. But I know she would have loved the idea of them being shared. From an early age, Haley and I were obsessed with anything to do with ghosts, hauntings, and demons. You name it, we were fascinated. We binge-watched scary movies and TV shows. Her dad was also a big fan of horror, and he often took us to see the latest horror flicks in the theater. We even created our own creepy tales and drew spooky pictures to go with them. We lived for the thrill of being scared, but sometimes we'd hide under the blankets when things got too intense. Most of the time, though, it was all fun and games, except for a few chilling moments. My mom didn't really approve of our obsession with the supernatural. Coming from a devout Catholic family, we went to church regularly, and prayers were a part of our daily routine. I had frequent nightmares as a kid, and my mom always blamed it on our interest in creepy things. Looking back, I can understand why, but even now, I sometimes think my Catholic upbringing contributed to many of my fears. Grandma's house had religious symbols everywhere, and she too was Catholic. I never thought much about it. Seeing a cross in every room felt normal. Despite her religious beliefs, Grandma let us watch as many scary movies and shows as we wanted. She would also share stories with us, one being about how she had once bought a Ouija board for my aunt as a birthday present. Grandma didn't go into much detail about what happened with it, but she did mention having a witch come by at some point to examine it. Why? I don't know. All I know is that the board ended up locked away in the attic. The attic had an old pull-down staircase in the back room of the house. It was divided into two parts. One section was for storage, where the Ouija board was kept, and the other was a small spare room with 2 beds. The only way to get into the storage area was through a small wooden door that had a simple sliding lock. First story: Haley and I were about 11 when the first strange event happened. It was a summer afternoon, and we had been playing outside before coming inside to cool off. Grandma, as usual, was in the living room watching Judge Judy. We grabbed some ice cream and headed to the back room where we always watch TV and movies. That day, we were watching a show about exorcisms. Intense stuff, and it had us totally hooked. Suddenly, we heard a scraping sound coming from the wall beside the couch. We snapped out of our trance, eyes darting to the noise. A cross was hanging on the wall, but it wasn't just hanging there anymore. It was slowly rotating until it stopped upside down. Time felt like it slowed as we stared, but it also happened incredibly fast. Without thinking, we screamed and ran to get Grandma. We were in a panic, trying to explain what we'd just seen. Calmly, Grandma got up to investigate. We followed her cautiously back to the room, only to find the cross now lying on the floor. She picked it up and explained that it couldn't have turned upside down on its own. It was held up by blue sticky putty. Haley and I stared at the cross, baffled. What we saw didn't make sense, but we knew it happened. Whether Grandma believed us or not, I'm still unsure, but she went back to her show like nothing had happened, leaving us alone again in that room. We never got an explanation for what occurred, and to this day, I still wonder about it. Second story: a few years later, when we were around 14, another unsettling event took place. Our cousins were staying the night at Grandma's house with us, and we all gathered in the back room to watch the movie One Missed Call. By the time the movie ended, most of our cousins had fallen asleep. It was late, so Haley and I decided to head up to the attic to sleep. We pulled down the attic stairs and climbed up to the small room with 2 beds. Haley often had trouble falling asleep, so she put on her headphones to listen to music while I quickly dozed off. I was in a deep sleep when I suddenly jolted awake, gasping for air like I had been hit in the chest. I sat up, struggling to breathe, and saw the small wooden door to the storage part of the attic being forcefully shoved open, hitting the wall. Haley had been awake and saw it too. She screamed, asking if I was okay, but I couldn't respond. I jumped out of bed and rushed down the stairs, with Haley right behind me. We found another room and slept on the floor for the rest of the night. There was no way we were going back up there. The next morning, we didn't tell anyone what had happened, nor did we check if the door was still open. We didn't have an explanation for the event, and I'll never forget it. The way the air seemed to be sucked out of me, the loud bang as the door flung open. Looking back, I've learned that when it comes to the paranormal, if you go searching for it, you won't always find it, but it just might find you. My family left the cabin in silence, and we haven't returned to the woods since. Stay safe, everyone. If you hear odd sounds in a new place, don't hesitate to leave or contact authorities. You never know what's near or what might be lurking beneath. Encounter in a coastal town * from Leah T. I'm a 33-year-old woman living in a seaside town in Northern California. I share a 2-bedroom place with a roommate and her cat. Our town has a beach on one side and some small hills on the other, along with a few riverbeds scattered around. We're situated just off a busy street, behind an old motel that has seen better days. There's an eerie rumor about the motel. It was supposedly a temporary stop for a serial killer back in the 1980s, who allegedly stored dismembered bodies in the bathtub. Between the motel and our apartment lies a fenced-off vacant lot, which we jokingly call the Death Lot. The area is overrun with dense bushes and small trees, providing cover for wild animals and the occasional drifter. There's also a narrow path winding between our building and the one behind us, passing our bathroom window, though the window is about 6 feet off the ground, so it's too high for anyone to see into from outside. Despite this, every time I pass the Death Lot, Especially at night, I feel uneasy. I'm not much into cannabis, but one night after a particularly exhausting weekend, I accepted an edible from my roommate to help with my aching muscles. That night, I had a vivid dream of being chased by something, what I could only describe as a skinwalker. I woke up with my heart pounding but quickly brushed it off as a side effect of the THC. After that, I didn't have any more skinwalker dreams. One night, when my roommate was out of town, her cat slept in my room. Everything was peaceful until around 4 a.m., when we were both jolted awake by a loud beeping sound, like a smoke alarm. It seemed to be coming from my room. Groggy and drenched in sweat, I immediately thought our building was on fire. I was disoriented and trying to make sense of everything, but by the time I got up, the alarm had stopped on its own. I hurried to check for any signs of a fire, but as I peered out the living room window, I didn't see anything unusual, except for a pure white cat staring fixedly into the death lot. Something about its stillness made me freeze. I stared at it for what felt like minutes, neither of us moving. Just then, my roommate's cat nudged my leg for attention. I glanced down briefly, and when I looked back up, the white cat had disappeared. I waited, expecting it to return, but it didn't. I checked the building, reassured myself that there was no fire, and returned to bed. Though I'd been hot and sweaty earlier, now I couldn't seem to get warm, which struck me as odd. The strange feeling lingered the next day, leaving me uneasy. I haven't heard phantom alarms or seen that cat again, but I've noticed the fence near the death lot has been bent down enough for a small animal, or a very slim person, to crawl under. About a month later, at around 8:30 p.m., I told my roommate I was going to take a shower. I left the bathroom door unlocked in case the cat needed to use his litter box inside. As I washed my hair, I heard a knock on the door. Thinking it was my roommate, I pulled back the shower curtain and called out, "What's up?" In response, I heard a strange version of my roommate's voice say, "It's me." We sometimes talk in playful voices, so I didn't think much of it. I opened the door, expecting to see the cat, but no one was there. I stood frozen for a moment in the steamy bathroom, my mind racing. Closing the door again, I tried to calm down, but something felt off. When I finished and came out, I asked my roommate if she had knocked. She swore she hadn't moved from her spot, and I believed her. Later, I realized with a chill that the knock could have come from the bathroom window, not the door. The final strange incident happened a few weeks later, just about 2 weeks ago. As I was getting into bed, I heard someone shouting from a distance, "Help me! Please help!" The voice didn't sound quite right. I listened as the cries continued, seeming to get closer until they reached the street corner. Looking out the window, I saw nothing. Neighbors came out of their houses, also alarmed by the sounds. I called 911 to report the disturbance, but the police didn't find anything. Eventually, the neighbors returned indoors, but I kept watch. After a while, I saw something move under a street lamp far off. It was too distant to make out features, but the way it moved was unusual, almost like it was limping. That was enough for me. I had done my part by calling for help, so I turned off the lights and tried to sleep, though my mind stayed alert for any more odd noises. This is my only personal encounter with something eerie, and it occurred during my first year of high school in the fall of 1987. It involved two of my buddies, Kev and Rob. I'm using altered names to keep their identities private. It was Halloween night, and we had just wrapped up our first football practice of the season. We were about 13 or 14 years old, your typical suburban kids from southern Pennsylvania. At that age, we felt too old for costumes and trick-or-treating, but we still wanted to grab some free candy, so we threw on our football jerseys and hit a few houses. Kev lived with barely any adult supervision, and with his long hair and carefree attitude, he was the cool one. He didn't seem to care much about school or rules. Rob and I came from more structured homes, with parents who made sure we did our homework. Kev, though, was like the leader of our group, probably because he could smoke at home and wore a leather jacket. We'd all recently gotten into heavy metal bands, Judas Priest, Metallica, Slayer, and we were really into the dark, rebellious vibe of the music. We'd even tried playing records backward to find hidden messages, thinking it made us hardcore. Kev had made a metal cross in shop class and sometimes wore it upside down, calling himself something like Iron Fist, a name from a song he liked. That night, after grabbing some candy, we went back to Rob's house. We ended up in his parents' bedroom for some reason, and I'm not sure why, but it was the only time I'd ever been in there. It was on the main level of their house, off the living room. While we sorted through our candy, the small radio on the nightstand suddenly switched on by itself. We all laughed it off as a coincidence and continued what we were doing. Then the lights started flickering. Kev took it as some kind of sign, especially since it was Halloween, and decided to bless the room using his cross. Rob and I were sitting on the bed, and Kev approached the clock radio with his cross turned upside down. He muttered something like, "I bless you in the name of," but I don't even want to repeat what he was implying, even decades later. Then, Kev noticed a crucifix hanging above the bedroom door. He raised his makeshift cross, and just as he started to speak again, I swear, I saw him lift off the floor by at least a couple of feet and get thrown backward onto the bed, crashing into both Rob and me. Scared out of my mind, I bolted into the hallway as the lights and radio went completely berserk. I glanced back and saw Kev choking, like he was trying to swallow his own tongue. Rob jumped on top of him, desperately trying to stop it, putting his fingers in Kev's mouth to help. I was frozen with fear, but I slowly moved back into the room. Kev's eyes were rolling back, and the lights and radio were still going haywire. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. A minute later, Rob was frantically asking Kev what had just happened, while I nervously paced in and out of the room. The three of us rushed out of the house and onto the front lawn. Kev didn't say anything. We stood on the lawn, looking up at the bedroom window, where the lights inside were still flickering, and we could hear the radio blaring. Rob was panicking since it was his parents' room, and he probably feared they'd find out and blame him. After about 10 minutes, everything calmed down. Kev was visibly shaken and still silent, probably from the shock. We were all terrified, and Rob eventually had to call Kev's mom to come pick him up. I'll never forget the look on Kev's face as he got into the car. He couldn't even make eye contact with us. That night, I was so scared I couldn't sleep. Every little sound sent chills down my spine, and I lay there in bed, crying. The next day at school, I waited for Kev outside, but it was clear he didn't want to talk about what had happened. Trying to lighten the mood, I jokingly asked him if he could use his powers to set our coach's car on fire. He laughed, and that made us all feel a little better. A few weeks later, Kev got kicked off the football team for something I can't remember, and the three of us slowly drifted apart, as kids do. Rob and I stayed in touch, but ended up in different friend groups by the time we finished high school. We never fully discussed that night again. Rob and I told the story to a few people, but most didn't believe us, chalking it up to Kev's Iron Fist persona. When I stopped telling the story to others, it felt a bit made up, so I've only told my wife and a few close people over the years. Since then, nothing out of the ordinary has happened to me, at least not that I'm aware of. I'm not even sure if this was a paranormal event or more of a spiritual one. Unusual Events in Idaho by Hannah. When I was young, I moved around a lot with my mom because my parents were separated. I have several stories, but I'll combine them into one since they all happened pretty close to each other. Just a heads up, this story briefly mentions self-harm. We lived in a small, isolated town in Idaho with 2 gas stations, a church, a school, several bars, and homes. The house we stayed in felt haunted, and I'm convinced it either was or still is. It was a small place with 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and both front and backyards. We lived there for about 2 years, and during that time, I often had the unsettling sense that someone was always watching me, no matter where I was. I've always been curious about the supernatural, and back then, I would play around with paranormal activities. The feeling of being watched grew stronger over time, and eventually, I began to feel as though I was being followed. I often saw shadowy figures that usually didn't do anything except stand around, watching me. Occasionally, I'd feel an icy hand touch my shoulder or back. I didn't think these shadow figures meant me any harm, so I tried to ignore them, hoping they'd leave me alone if I didn't give them attention. As time went on, things got worse, and I became extremely paranoid. The constant sensation of being watched became overwhelming. I started waking up with light scratches on my arms and near my stomach. My dogs didn't sleep with me, and I had never experienced anything like this before. So I tried to tell myself I must have scratched myself in my sleep. But to my 14-year-old self, that explanation didn't really make sense since it had never happened before. My younger brother, Jay, and my stepbrother, R, would also occasionally see the shadow figures, especially R, who saw them more often than Jay. This confirmed to me that I wasn't imagining the figures I saw from the corner of my eye or sometimes even right in front of me. One morning, I went to my closet and noticed something strange. Inside, there was a small door leading to a crawl space. On the door, I found random scratches and shallow carvings of shapes and letters that didn't form any words. I couldn't explain it. At that time, I didn't have any sharp objects, aside from scissors, due to my history with self-harm. And it couldn't have been my siblings, as the door made noise when opened, and I used a doorstop to keep it closed since the lock was on the outside, not the inside. Even if it had been one of them, I would have heard them. Another time, I was outside in the front yard with R. My sister and Jay had already gone to bed. There was a flimsy 3 to 4 foot chain link fence separating the front and backyards. I froze when I glanced at the back of the house and saw 3 figures leaning out from behind, as if they were trying to watch us without being seen. They were shadowy shapes with glowing white-yellow eyes. I asked R if he saw them too, and he said yes. We were both so scared that we quickly ran back inside. After that, I would sometimes see those same figures outside, peeking through the windows like they were watching us from the outside. I should start by mentioning that I don't consider myself a particularly spiritual person. In fact, I usually think of myself as more of a skeptic. That said, I am 100% convinced of the existence of ghosts, demons, and other paranormal things. I've even had my own encounters with demons in the past. For a bit of background, I'm a 29-year-old guy from a tiny town in rural Kentucky with a population of about 300. Although I was actually born in a bigger city of around 55,000, I now live in the middle of nowhere with my 76-year-old grandmother, and I've been here for a few years after a rough divorce. We do have neighbors about 50 yards down the road, but it's pretty peaceful out here. The house I live in is an older one, built sometime in the early 1900s, but it's been modernized with things like motion-activated porch lights. The road we live on is flanked by cornfields and woods, so it's pretty isolated and quiet. This experience took place one winter night when I was the only one awake in the house. I work night shifts, so a regular sleep schedule isn't really an option for me. It's not uncommon for me to be up at odd hours of the night. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone during a decent snowfall. Since we didn't have internet at the time, I was browsing through a local online marketplace, looking for project cars. I glanced up from my phone and saw the biggest white-tailed buck I'd ever laid eyes on. It had to weigh at least 230 pounds, maybe more. Mesmerized, I watched it graze for a bit. Everything was calm when suddenly, a massive black, furry shape lunged out of nowhere and tackled the deer to the ground. The struggle lasted maybe 10 or 15 seconds before the buck went still. Through the snowfall, I managed to get a better look at the creature. It looked like a huge black wolf. Wolves were once common in Kentucky, but were mostly wiped out in the wild in the 1800s because of deforestation and industrial expansion. So we don't see them around here anymore. We do have plenty of coyotes, but they usually hunt in packs. This creature, however, was alone. After the deer was dead, the beast calmed down and got back up on all fours. I was stunned by its size. For reference, I'm about 5 feet 7 inches and weigh 205 pounds, and this thing had to be at least 4 feet tall at the shoulders. Its fur was so dark it made it hard to see any details, but under the light of the full moon, I could make out some of its features. I can't recall the exact time, but if I had to guess, it was around 12:45 a.m. I let out a small gasp when I saw the creature attack the deer. I was frozen, unable to move or speak. All I could do was watch as fear washed over me. The creature dragged the buck away in its jaws, its sharp teeth at least 4 inches long. Its muscles rippled under its fur as it carried the deer into the woods across the road, and just like that, it vanished. I didn't see it for the rest of the night. All I could do afterward was try to get some sleep, though I wish I could say that was the last time I saw it. It wasn't. The next morning, I woke up still trying to make sense of what I'd witnessed. After breakfast, I got dressed and went outside to see if I could find any traces of the creature, to convince myself it wasn't just a hallucination. But there were no tracks, no blood, and no signs of a struggle. The fresh snow had covered any evidence. I started to doubt what I saw until I looked up into the trees. There, 30 or 40 feet up, were the remains of the buck. Whatever had attacked it had devoured most of the animal, leaving only the skull and spine hanging in a blood-soaked tree. I was horrified. I gathered myself and tried to carry on with my day, thinking that would be the end of it. But 2 weeks later, I had another encounter. As I mentioned, it's not unusual for me to be awake late at night. As I type this, it's about 3:30 a.m. where I live. I'm a heavy sleeper. Earthquakes, storms, and even loud noises rarely wake me. That night, though, I was sound asleep when I was jolted awake by an overwhelming feeling of dread. The porch light had been triggered. Everything inside me was screaming not to move, to stay on the couch and go back to sleep. But I couldn't ignore the urge to find out what was causing that fear. I lifted my head, still wrapped in my blanket, and looked out the window. The same window where I had first seen the creature. There it was again, staring right at me. We locked eyes for what felt like ages. The moment I saw its glowing red eyes, my blood ran cold. I couldn't speak or move. All I could manage was a shaky gasp, as though I wanted to cry but couldn't. My first instinct was to hide under my blanket like a frightened child, but I didn't know what else to do. I lay there for several minutes, praying that the beast wouldn't break into the house and make me its next meal. I could hear its long claws tapping against the porch as it paced back and forth. Then, it let out a scream, an eerie, bone-chilling sound that made me feel sick. It was like a mix of a train whistle and a wolf's howl, a sound I'll never forget. After what seemed like forever, the sound stopped and the porch light went out. I finally exhaled in relief. I'm not a religious person and my family is Christian, but I've never been particularly devoted. Even so, I'm not sure what I saw those nights. After the second encounter, I did some research and everything I read points to it being a hellhound. Hellhound sightings are incredibly rare in these parts, but stories of them date back to the 1600s in New England. For those who don't know, a hellhound is said to be a guardian of the underworld, similar to Cerberus from Greek mythology, a massive, black dog that guards the gates of the afterlife. Folklore also claims they are omens of death. There's an old saying that goes, "If you see the black dog once, it brings joy. If twice, it brings sorrow. And the third time means death." I don't know about anyone else, but I've seen this creature 4 times, and each time, all I've felt is raw, primal fear. Fortunately, I haven't seen it for months now, and I hope it stays that way. I doubt shooting it would do much good, so all I can do is hope it never comes back, and that I don't end up on its list of meals. Folklore is an odd thing. Tales handed down through the years, stories that have somehow stood the test of time. Why do some stories disappear like the last sparks of a dying fire, while others stay alive forever? I think for a story to become folklore, it needs to teach a timeless lesson, and most of all, have some truth to it. Sure, some parts get exaggerated like in a game of telephone, but the core message stays the same. The truth sits somewhere between the suspense and the sudden jolts, and we can feel it. We sense the storyteller's belief in the tale, and that stays with us, follows us home, urging us to share it too. There's something about saying it aloud that makes it feel lighter, less believable, but we know better. Let me tell you about a local legend from where I grew up and the night it became real for me. My granddad used to tell us this story on warm summer evenings as we sat on his porch, watching the sun dip below the trees and the night creeping in. Now, listen closely, he would start. This isn't just any ghost story. It's the truth with a bit of a bite. Years ago, there was a family living out here, moving closer to town. They'd spent all day hauling their stuff back and forth. The father drove the truck, the son sat beside him, and their daughter, Lily, was in the back with the furniture, making sure nothing flew off. As they crossed the bridge just down the road, you know the one, something terrible happened. A gust of wind caught one of the heavier pieces of furniture, pulling it off the truck, and Lily along with it. Poor girl. As she tumbled out, she got swept under the wheel of the truck, and it took her head clean off, tossing it into the murky water below the bridge. Everyone around here knows it's bad luck to bury someone incomplete. The spirit won't rest unless the body is whole. So, the whole town pitched in to help search for Lily's head, so her family could lay her to rest properly. But despite all their efforts, it was never found. Even today, her head still lies somewhere in the dark waters below. They say if you cross the bridge at night, Lily's ghost might jump onto your car, searching for her head. And if you don't get across quick enough, she might just take yours instead. Granddad always followed that tale with a story about Ike, a farmhand who once had an encounter with Lily's spirit. Ike, a superstitious man, lived on the far side of Lily's bridge and had to cross it daily to get to my granddad's farm. Ike dreaded crossing the bridge at night, so my granddad started letting him borrow the tractor to ease his fear and get him home faster. One night, as Ike was heading home, he was halfway across the bridge when the tractor sputtered and stopped without reason. I kept trying to restart it, but the machine was dead. That's when he felt it, the air around him seemed to buzz. His skin tingled with goosebumps, and his hair stood on end. Then, the tractor jolted, as if something heavy had landed on it. Ike felt what he described as hundreds of tiny threads brushing against his neck and crawling towards his face. That's when he caught the smell, the foul stench of swamp mud. The sensation spread across his cheeks, and his vision blurred as if something was covering his eyes. He leapt from the tractor and ran the rest of the way across the bridge. When he reached the other side, he turned and saw the tractor bounce again, like something had jumped off. I quit his job the very next day, and Granddad had to retrieve the tractor because I wouldn't go near that bridge again, even in daylight. I loved that story and begged Granddad to tell it over and over. I must have heard it 100 times. Over time, my fear of Lily and her bridge faded, the legend becoming just another familiar tale to me. But then, I experienced its truth firsthand. Years later, as a teenager, I'd sneak out at night to mess around with friends. One summer evening, we were hanging out in a loft, filled with stolen road signs, when someone had a bright idea. "We should grab a sign from Lily's bridge," one friend suggested. Everyone agreed it was a brilliant plan. "You live closest," another friend pointed out. "It'll be easy for you." I hesitated, but I couldn't say no, or they'd never let me live it down. So it was decided I would head to Lily's bridge and return with a sign. That night was sweltering as I slipped out of my bedroom window and grabbed my tools. I hopped in my golf cart and drove towards the bridge. The air was thick and muggy, but the rush of wind against my face made it bearable. As I neared the bridge, the dark seemed to press in on me, and my headlights flickered off the yellow-striped sign at the bridge's entrance. That was my target. Just as I reached the bridge, my golf cart began acting up, picked up speed, then slowed to a crawl, and finally stopped entirely, plunging me into darkness. "Great," I muttered, thinking the battery was dead, though that didn't make sense. It had been fully charged. I kept trying to start it, but nothing happened. Suddenly, the headlights flickered on and off, lighting up the bridge for a moment before plunging me back into blackness. Then I heard it, something moving in the water below, followed by a soft dripping sound. When the lights flashed on again, I saw something on the bridge, a yellowish clump of what looked like hair lying in the middle of the road. My heart raced. I knew what it was before my mind could accept it. Slowly, the strands of hair began to rise, one by one, as if pulled by static. Soon, a face emerged, with a single eye staring right at me. The lights flickered out again, but I could feel it. It was watching me. I frantically tried to start the golf cart. After what felt like forever, the engine finally kicked in. I threw the cart into reverse and sped away from the bridge, hearing a splash behind me as I left. Now that I have kids of my own, they often ask me to tell that story on cold nights around the fire. I always oblige, knowing that telling a story somehow makes it seem less real. Maybe it's the company, the laughter when the story ends, or the way they ask, "Is it true?" just before bed. No, I tell them it's just a story. Now go to sleep, but deep down, we all know better stories like this stick around because they hold just a bit of truth. I grew up in a rough environment. My mom left my dad when I was very little, and we were left struggling. My dad had to work 2 jobs just to cover rent, so he was rarely home. This meant that from around the age of 9, I was mostly on my own, learning how to take care of myself until I eventually went off to college. Fortunately, I earned a scholarship which allowed me to pursue higher education. I majored in wildlife conservation, something that always fascinated me. I loved studying how animals interacted and thrived in their environments. After years of dedication, I graduated with a master's degree in wildlife biology. I started searching for jobs near my hometown, but nothing was available within 25 miles. Eventually, I found a position in Houston, Texas. I was relieved that I didn't have to move out of state, so I quickly sent in my application. A few days later, I was called in for an interview. I drove up to Houston, met with the company, and was thrilled to receive the job offer. After the interview, I explored the city and found a small apartment in a quiet area. It was cozy, perfect for a single guy like me. I lived in that apartment for about 4 years before deciding to propose to my girlfriend, Emily. She said yes, and we got married shortly after. Not long after our wedding, we moved out of the apartment and bought a small house. Fast forward several years, and we had 3 children. Life was hectic. The constant noise, traffic, and cramped living space made it hard to cope. So we decided to move to a quieter area. We found a lovely house in the town of Silver Creek, about a 25-minute drive from my office. It was a peaceful town, and our new home was in a gated community with only about 25 houses. Our new neighborhood was serene, surrounded by nature, which was perfect for me as a wildlife lover. The kids loved the house, and so did Emily. It had 4 bedrooms, a large living room, and a pool in the backyard that overlooked Pine River, a small creek that ran behind our house. The river wasn't very deep, just about 3 feet, and every now and then we'd go down to watch turtles swim by, which the kids enjoyed. Years went by, and our kids grew up, leaving me with a bit of free time to learn how to golf. There was a golf course across the river, and after a few weeks, I bought a golf cart. One summer evening, Emily took the girls out for a mother-daughter night, leaving me with some free time. I decided to hit the golf course before sunset. It was around 6 p.m., so I had plenty of daylight left. I hopped into my golf cart and headed towards the course. To get there, I had to drive down a small alley between 2 houses and cross a bridge over Pine River. As I crossed the bridge, I heard a splash in the water. Curious, I stopped the cart and peered over the edge, but saw nothing in the water. The creek was clear, unlike most rivers in the area, but no fish, no turtles, nothing. I brushed it off and continued to the golf course. After a couple of hours of golfing, it got too dark to see, so I packed up my clubs and headed home. As I was driving, I noticed some forgotten golf balls in a sand trap. I needed more, so I got out to pick them up. As I bent down, I heard a sharp cry in the distance. I looked around but didn't see anything, just trees and the bridge far off. I thought it might have been a fox, as they make sounds that can resemble a human scream. A thought struck me. Maybe an animal had fallen into the creek when I heard that splash earlier. I rushed to the bridge, hoping to help, but once again, there was nothing. Confused, I went home, cleaned up, and got ready to grill some burgers. As I flipped the burgers, I heard another scream, louder this time. I walked over to the riverbank to check, but once again, found nothing. By now, I was getting spooked. Later, as I ate my dinner, staring out at the yard through the window, everything was quiet. That silence was broken when Emily and the girls returned home. They were exhausted, but after giving me a hug, they went straight to bed. I was still unsettled by the strange noises when one of my daughters called out, "Dad, why is Grandma Rita in the backyard?" Rita was our elderly neighbor who the girls thought of as their grandma. I looked outside, and sure enough, an old woman was standing by the creek. I squinted to make out her figure. It did look like Rita, but why was she out so late? Emily whispered, "What's she doing out there?" "I'm not sure," I replied. I went outside and called, "Rita, are you okay?" She didn't respond. As I got closer, I noticed a foul odor, like stagnant water. "Do you need help?" I asked again. No answer. Puzzled, I walked back inside and told Emily I'd go check on her husband, Tom. I rang their doorbell and Tom answered, surprised to see me so late. "Want a drink? Rita can grab one for you," he said. To my shock, Rita poked her head out from the kitchen. "Wait, Rita, you're inside? I just saw you in my backyard," I exclaimed. The couple exchanged uneasy glances before Tom said, "Sounds like you met her." "Who?" I asked. "That woman by the river. We call her Evelyn. She's not someone you want to meet." They explained that they'd seen this mysterious figure a few times before and had even tried to confront her, but she just screamed and disappeared. At that moment, panic struck me. I rushed home, where I found the back door wide open. I dashed upstairs to find my family huddled in the closet, terrified. "She's inside the house," my wife cried. I grabbed a bat and slowly walked downstairs, only to find the strange woman on the steps, staring at me with lifeless eyes. She backed away and slipped out the back door, leaving water droplets on the floor. I bolted back upstairs, told my family it was just Rita to calm them down, and we spent the rest of the night at Tom and Rita's house. The next day, we searched the local library for answers. We found an old article from 1910 about a woman found dead in a nearby creek. Could it have been her? We never found out. Since that night, we moved far away. Tom and Rita eventually moved too, but they told us they occasionally still saw Evelyn by the river. We can only hope she's found peace. Back in early July 2020, something strange happened. I was part of a hiking group for teenagers in northern Greece at the time, and that's where this unsettling event took place. It was a warm evening, and I had spent the day with my group, enjoying a campfire with songs and games. One thing about me, though, is that I like to smoke, so after the night's activities ended, I'd often go off by myself to smoke quietly. That night, after everything wrapped up, I wandered into the forest near our campsite to enjoy my cigarette alone. It was peaceful, with the wind rustling through the trees and distant birds calling. About 20 or 30 meters away, I saw some deer grazing. I watched them for a while, scrolling through my phone to pass the time, making sure not to disturb them. It felt comforting to have them nearby. After around half an hour, things changed. The usual forest sounds faded. The birds stopped chirping, and the small animals moving around seemed to vanish. I noticed that even the deer had stopped eating. They looked around nervously, as if sensing something. Then, out of nowhere, a loud howl broke the silence. It sounded like a mix of a man's scream and an animal's howl. I knew immediately that this wasn't normal. There weren't any wolves in the region, so I knew something wasn't right. Having spent time outdoors since I was a kid, I knew sudden silence in the woods could mean one thing. A large predator was nearby. I stayed still and quiet, barely breathing. Then the howl came again, this time much closer. The deer bolted, leaving me standing there, deep in the woods, completely alone. I could hear rustling in the bushes ahead, maybe 25 or 30 meters away. That's when I saw them. Two glowing amber yellow eyes staring straight at me from the bushes. It was like they were piercing right through me, and I froze in place, terrified. The eyes were low at first, but soon, whatever creature it was stepped out of the shadows. It was a full moon that night, so I saw it clearly. The creature stood on two legs, much taller than a human, maybe over 2 meters tall. Its legs bent backward like a dog's, but its arms ended in clawed hands, not paws. Its body was covered in thick, dark fur, with a reddish tint, and its head. It was like a wolf, but more terrifying. Its long snout and pointed ears reminded me of something straight out of a nightmare, and its eyes had an almost human look to them. I realized I was face to face with something that could only be described as a werewolf. Slowly, I stood up, careful not to make any sudden moves. I didn't want it to see me as prey, so I began to back away, step by step, hoping to make it back to the camp. But it mirrored my movement, coming closer, showing its sharp teeth. I knew it was getting ready to strike. Suddenly, it snarled and swiped its claws at a nearby tree, closing the distance between us. Just as it got about 10 meters away from me, a deer shot out from the bushes. It seemed to distract the creature. It glanced between me and the deer, then let out a howl before dropping onto all fours and racing after the deer instead. As soon as it disappeared into the woods, I ran as fast as I could back to camp, shaking uncontrollably. When I got there, my friends saw how pale and sweaty I was and asked if I was okay. I told them not to worry, though I could barely speak. That night, I lay in my tent, unable to sleep, listening to every sound outside. I could still hear howls in the distance. I left the group not long after that and never returned. The memory of that creature still haunts me, and I often have nightmares of it following me through the trees. To anyone reading this, be careful when you're out in the wilderness. You never know what might be lurking, waiting for its chance to strike. I was lucky to get away that night, but next time you might not be so fortunate. It all began when my relatives came to visit from Colorado to Oregon for a family gathering. A few days after the event, we decided to take a trip to a beach by the coast to relax. We spent several hours paddleboarding, fishing, chatting with family, and enjoying fresh fruits on the soft, warm sand. As the evening approached, this was in Oregon, so the sun stayed up until nearly 9 p.m. We packed up our things. We wanted to show our cousins an old abandoned fort nearby. The fort was fascinating. It was built in a unique shape, with rooms along the edges and a long, dark hallway running down the middle. The structure was embedded in a hillside, and you could climb on top of it to get a great view from the edge. While most of the group stayed down with our aunt, let's call her Lisa, I followed along but was soon by myself exploring. Lisa asked, "Hey kids, do you want to go up and walk on top of the fort?" Everyone was excited about the idea except for me. I'd been there many times before. Still, I went up with them. The top of the fort was smooth and grassy, sloping into the forest on the far side. Eventually, my aunt and cousins wandered back down to the ground, leaving me alone on top. I foolishly decided not to head back the same way, but instead walked around the entire flat surface of the fort. Halfway across, an unsettling feeling crept over me. They say that when you're in real danger, your heart races, and that's exactly what happened. My chest tightened, and I could feel my heart pounding. Something was off. The birds that usually circled the area had gone silent, as if they had vanished. I scanned the surroundings and noticed a deer standing at the edge of the woods, staring at me. First, I felt relieved, but something was wrong. As I focused on the deer, I saw its eyes, forward-facing and unnaturally sharp, like a predator's. My stomach dropped. I knew enough about animals to realize that this was far from normal. At 14 years old, I was a huge fan of wildlife, and this deer's eyes were simply wrong. They weren't the kind of eyes you'd see on a gentle creature. I didn't know what to do. For some strange reason, I remembered a TV show where characters had to keep their eyes on a bird to avoid getting attacked. So, I locked my gaze on the deer and began slowly backing away. As I kept watching, the deer's neck twisted in an eerie, unnatural circle, its bizarre eyes still glued to me. Panic set in. Okay, once you reach the slope, you're going to run. Run fast, I told myself. The deer remained twisted in that impossible position, staring. I couldn't take the fear any longer. I bolted. Thanks to all the time I'd spent running, I made it to the parking lot in what felt like no time at all. "What's going on?" Lisa and my mom asked when they saw my panic. I quickly explained everything, insisting that we needed to leave immediately. Later, when we got home, I told the rest of the family. One of my other aunts, let's call her Tina, asked if it could have been something supernatural, like a shapeshifter or something else. I wasn't sure what it was, but I just knew that the deer was wrong. Its eyes, its movements, everything. My other aunt, Rose, suggested it might have been a creature she'd heard of called a knot deer. To this day, I'm not sure if it was some strange cryptid, a shapeshifter, or simply the creepiest deer ever. But I'm thankful that whatever it was didn't chase me or try to harm me as I ran. My encounter on Mount Haverly by James Holtman first. I want to say that I don't recommend anyone pushing their luck in this area. Something is just off about it. Mount Haverly in Preston County, New Hampshire, seems like a regular place for hiking, horse riding, and biking. But it's far from ordinary. Many creepy stories have come from there, and some believe the mountain is cursed. To be honest, a lot of terrifying events have occurred. In the 1700s, a strange creature reportedly attacked a wagon. Several hikers have vanished, only to be found in areas that had already been searched. There are also stories of ghostly kids, a red-haired hitchhiker, eerie noises, and roaring from deep within the forest. The scariest story involves a man who disappeared while on a bus headed for Preston. He was on the last stop before it, but when the bus arrived at its destination, he was gone. There might be something happening up there. The native tribes of the area avoided the peak except for burials. In 2013, I had my own frightening experience there. I always come prepared with a map, compass, food, drinks, and a whistle in case I get lost. When I set foot on Mount Haverly for a hike, a thick fog rolled in. I hoped it wouldn't rain or storm. At first, everything seemed fine, but I soon noticed an odd silence. My footsteps sounded like they were sinking into mud, and I could barely hear the chirping of birds or the hum of insects. After some time, I came across a torn shirt, like someone had cut it up with a knife. I remembered the stories of the Haverly creature and felt a shiver, but I kept moving forward. After a while, the fog became so dense that I couldn't tell where I was. I looked down and saw shoe prints, size 9, probably a Nike brand, the same size I was wearing. Oddly, the footprints circled around to where I stood, meaning I had walked in a complete loop. I blew my whistle, hoping for an echo, but heard nothing. No matter which direction I took, I ended up in the same place. It made no sense. Then I heard the crunching of leaves, like someone else was nearby. I swear I saw a man in a flannel shirt pass by through the mist, but he disappeared as quickly as he came. Shortly after, I noticed a strange rock with something carved into it, man-eater, with an arrow pointing at the stone. It seemed like a weird joke, but I didn't stick around to find out. Continuing on, I found a pair of cracked sunglasses. At this point, I started to wonder if I would end up like the people who left these items, abandoned and lost in the woods. I pulled out my compass, but the needle kept spinning, possibly because of some magnetic disturbance. I was completely lost, confused, and anxious. I blew my whistle again, but the silence continued. I tried calling the ranger's office, but there was no phone service. I was starting to feel desperate when a man in a yellow raincoat appeared through the mist. He asked if I needed help, and I told him I was lost. He smiled and said, "Don't worry, I've been here forever. If you've passed the Man-Eater Rock, head west or north, and you'll be fine. East or south will just get you more lost." I thanked him and followed his advice, heading north. As I walked, the fog began to lift, and I could finally see where I was going. I made it back to where I had started, checked my watch, and noticed the time, 2:32 p.m. I had begun the hike at 2 o'clock. There was no way I had only been out there for half an hour, but maybe I had. Or perhaps I let my imagination get the best of me after that experience. To this day, I'm not sure what really happened on Mount Haverly, but I've promised myself I'll never go back. In the summer of 2012, graduating from university felt like a challenge. I had spent 4 years earning a degree, only to find that the job market had nearly dried up. As frustrated as I was about being jobless for the foreseeable future, I found a deep love for backcountry camping and hiking that summer. Growing up near the Appalachian Mountains and graduating from college in eastern Kentucky, I was no stranger to hiking or camping, but that summer it became an escape, almost an obsession. I went on daily hikes and camped under the stars, which really helped my mental health as I worried about my purpose and future. It was June, and the weather was unusually cold, wet, and cloudy. Daytime temperatures barely reached 50 degrees, and at night they dropped below freezing. Despite the cold, I had planned to hike in the Blue Ridge Range that week, and I wasn't about to let the weather change my plans. My route was to hike from Cascade Lake, over Cascade Pass, and down to Upper Clear Lake. Getting to Cascade Lake is tough and requires a four-wheel drive vehicle and some decent driving skills. The road is a narrow path winding through thick forests of pines. The rain made the way slick, but I managed to reach the top with a bit of nerves. I set up camp on the northern shore of the lake and decided to try some fishing. The fishing was miserable. It was freezing, and nothing was biting. The best part about bad fishing, though, is that it gives you time to let your mind wander. I sat there, listening to the constant light drizzle, which created a soothing, natural white noise. After some time, my daydreams were interrupted by a low rumble coming from up the canyon. It overpowered the sound of the rain. The rumbling was similar to the distant sound of a diesel engine, but there were no roads beyond where I had camped. No vehicles or machinery could be up that canyon. Maybe it was a plane, I thought, looking up into the clouds. But the sound wasn't coming from above. It wasn't getting closer or farther away. It stayed constant, echoing beyond the lake and up into the canyon. This wasn't a plane, a truck, or a bulldozer. It wasn't outright terrifying, but my hair stood on end. I just sat there, listening until after about 20 minutes, the rumbling stopped, and the only sound left was the rain again. Eventually, I caught a decent-sized fish, cleaned it, and headed back to camp to get ready for dinner. The fish cooked fine, but honestly, I don't like trout. It's edible, but it tastes like mud. I ate as much as I could stand and tossed the rest into the lake. I built up my fire for the night and sat back to enjoy the evening with a bit of whiskey. Night came fast, as the mountain ridges made the sun disappear early, and the rain clouds blocked out the stars. It was really dark. The crackling of the fire and the rain pattering on my tent were comforting, helping me drift off to sleep. I reminded myself I needed to build up the fire one last time before bed. I got up and grabbed an armful of firewood. Away from the crackling fire, I could hear that same rumbling again, this time louder and closer. I had probably had too much whiskey by then, and I was tired and irritated. This noise was ruining my camping trip. Frustrated, I yelled into the night, "Hey, shut up!" As if someone flipped a switch, the rumbling stopped, and so did the rain. My heart skipped a beat. This was no coincidence. There was something out there, something aware of me, something listening, and I wasn't getting a good feeling about it. I threw the logs onto the fire and retreated into my tent, on edge. I just sat there, listening to the fire crackle, to my own fast breathing, and to the stillness of the dark night. Before this, I had felt alone but safe. Now I felt alone and exposed. Beyond the firelight, it seemed like a million unseen eyes were watching me. My nerves started to settle when, suddenly, the rain returned, this time a torrential downpour. I was thankful I'd built up the fire because it would have been extinguished by the rain otherwise. The storm was intense, and I considered retreating to my truck but knew I'd be drenched instantly. That slick, muddy road wasn't a safe option in the dark. Besides, I'd had too much whiskey to drive safely. Feeling unsafe in my flimsy tent, I grabbed what I could, unzipped the flap, and made a run for my truck. By the time I got inside, I was soaked. I locked the door, turned on the heat full blast, and tried to warm up. It was going to be a long, miserable night. I reclined the seat and took deep breaths, trying to calm down. The rain pounded on the roof, and the fire, though still burning brightly, was barely holding its ground. I checked the clock in the truck. It was 1:06 a.m. I blinked. When I opened my eyes again, everything had changed. The rain had stopped. It was foggy and quiet. The once raging campfire was down to glowing embers, and the sky was lightening with the first hints of dawn. My truck clock now read 5:45 a.m. I had lost nearly 5 hours in what felt like a blink. My head throbbed, but I didn't think I had drunk that much to cause this kind of hangover. I turned off the truck and stepped out to assess the damage. My tent was flattened, the poles snapped, and everything was soaked. After putting everything into the truck, I knew my hike over the pass wasn't happening that day. By the time I finished packing up, it was 6:30 a.m., and as I got into the cab, I heard that familiar rumbling again, echoing through the morning fog. Without a second thought, I drove out of there as fast as the muddy road would let me, not once looking in the rearview mirror. I've never been back to Cascade Lake, and I don't plan to. A couple of years ago, my partner and I, having hiked several sections of different trails, decided to explore the southern part of the Virginia Trail. This stretch runs about 160 miles through 2 national forests, beginning in one county and ending in another. It's known for being more secluded, which was exactly what we wanted. We gathered our supplies and headed to the start of the Virginia Creeper Trail to begin our adventure. Our plan was to finish in a small town, where we'd be more than ready to return home and sleep in our own beds. It was early October, and the leaves were changing, making for stunning scenery. The air was cool and crisp, perfect for hiking. Most of the journey was uneventful, but the last few nights got strange. On this part of the trail, you're supposed to camp along the path or at designated shelters. But we wanted some privacy and didn't want anyone stumbling upon us in the middle of the night, so we chose our own spot a bit off the trail. After some searching, we found a small clearing, set up camp, cooked, chatted, and went to sleep. Around 2 a.m., I was shaken awake by my partner, who whispered that she heard footsteps around the tent. She said it sounded like someone was dragging something sharp around the outside. While hiking, I usually carry a firearm, just in case we encounter danger in remote areas. I grabbed my gun and we listened silently. For a few minutes, all we heard was the wind through the trees. Then I heard it, a snap, crunch, snap. Something or someone was moving in the woods behind our tent. I grabbed a flashlight and quietly exited the tent. The fire had gone out, and it was almost pitch dark except for the moonlight. I told my partner to stay put while I checked it out. I waited a few moments before turning on the flashlight to avoid revealing my position. After some silence, I heard another snap and turned on the light. I thought I saw movement behind a tree, so I yelled out, warning whoever it was that I was armed. As I slowly approached the spot, I suddenly heard something running off in the woods from another direction. Whatever it was had taken off. I returned to the campsite, told my partner what happened, and stayed up on guard until morning. The next day, I found a boot print in the soft ground near our tent. It wasn't ours, which confirmed someone had been there. I didn't mention it to her because I didn't want to scare her even more. We still had 2 days left, so we hiked faster than usual, trying to cover as much ground as possible. That night, we camped near a cliff, where no one could sneak up on us from behind. The whole day, I had the unsettling feeling that we were being followed. I hadn't seen anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling. We set up camp, ate, and retreated into the tent. I gave my partner my smaller gun and kept my main one nearby, assuring her I'd be sleeping lightly. After a while, she fell asleep, but I stayed awake, listening to the forest. I was on high alert for hours until exhaustion finally overtook me. I woke up to the sound of someone rustling through our things outside. I grabbed my gun and gently woke my partner, telling her to be quiet. In the faint glow of the dying fire, I saw a silhouette outside the tent. I shouted a warning, and they immediately ran off. I rushed out of the tent, gun in hand, and saw our belongings scattered around. They had gone through quite a bit. I walked to the edge of the nearby creek and saw a light flickering, probably a lantern. Then I saw 3 more lights appear on the other side of the woods. I told my partner to start packing up, and we left immediately, leaving behind our tent and some other items. As we hiked in the dark, I kept hearing voices and the sound of branches snapping in the woods. It was nerve-wracking, especially since we were still a long way from civilization. As dawn was breaking, we rounded a corner, and I looked back to see a figure step onto the trail. They just stood there watching us. I couldn't make out any details, just a dark silhouette. I shouted, asking who they were and what they wanted, but they didn't respond. After a moment, they turned and walked back into the woods. We picked up the pace and didn't stop until we reached the trailhead where our car was parked. We were exhausted but relieved. We left the Virginia woods, thankful we hadn't encountered any real danger. I still don't know who those people were or what they wanted, and I don't plan to find out. This is a story my dad has shared with me multiple times. My father is a logger, and he operates a large tree-cutting machine that can bring down massive trees and cut them into specific lengths. Because of his job, he spends a lot of time alone in the remote woods. In his crew, my dad was given locations to work at, and he would head there to cut down trees. He got paid based on how many trees he cut, not how long it took. To finish faster, he worked 16 to 20-hour shifts regularly. Once he finished cutting, the rest of the crew would come in, clean up the trees, and haul them to the mill. About half of the time, my dad worked by himself. The other half, he worked with a fellow operator named Ron. They communicated through radios whenever they were working together, which becomes important later. One time, my dad and Ron were sent to a new job site, and after about 10 days, things started to get strange. They kept hearing odd, broken chatter on their radios. No matter which radio channel they switched to, the strange noise seemed to follow them as they moved deeper into the mountains. As they got further along, the sounds from the radio became clearer, though they couldn't make out full sentences. Both my dad and Ron agreed that something wasn't right. They also started to find strange containers and evidence that someone else had been in the area. This was a very remote location, nearly a 3-hour drive up the mountain. They had spent 3 weeks clearing roads just so their trucks and equipment could make it to the site. It became clear to them that there were people around who shouldn't have been there. The worst part, they were stuck for another week or so before they could leave, only going down the mountain occasionally to refuel their machines and buy supplies. One day, Ron came across a tent and called my dad over. They decided to investigate and found a single sleeping bag and a duffel bag inside. What they found in the bag was disturbing. Several pairs of children's underwear, along with rope, duct tape, and drawings of children, as well as photos of kids who seemed unaware they were being watched. There was also a small amount of food, including canned goods and an apple. The apple was fresh, indicating someone had been at the tent recently. They were now stuck on the mountain, isolated, and possibly dealing with a dangerous individual. Ron wanted to leave immediately, but my dad, always determined to finish his work, insisted they complete the job before leaving. They agreed to only use their radios in emergencies and see if they could hear more from the mysterious voices. As they worked, they were close enough to hear conversations between two men on the radio. They talked about gathering water and firewood, which seemed normal, except these men clearly didn't belong there, and the tent they found was likely theirs. At the end of one workday, my dad overheard the men discussing gathering brush for a fire. He got on the radio and tried to contact them, asking, "Who are you, and what are you doing here?" After that, the men went silent and never spoke on the radio again. That night, Ron woke my dad up, whispering that someone was outside. The first thing my dad noticed when he woke up was the sound of quiet footsteps outside their camper. He fumbled around for his gun but realized it wasn't loaded, and he had no idea where his bullets were. Ron had no weapon, and calling the police was pointless due to how far they were from any town. Then, they heard the door handle rattle, and the door opened. Their camper was high off the ground, with no ladder or steps, so someone had to climb up. The door stayed open, but neither my dad nor Ron moved. After a few minutes, they heard scratching right outside the door. For long minutes passed before my dad, unable to take it anymore, nodded to Ron. He quietly got up and approached the door. Just as he reached it, he was slashed across the face from his right eye to his left cheek. He fell out of the camper, hitting the ground hard. A man with a knife jumped on top of him. Another man came up from behind and started kicking him in the head. Ron quickly jumped out of the camper and fought off the attacker. My dad got up, and the second man, the one without the knife, started to run away. The man with the knife scrambled to his feet and took off after his accomplice. My dad and Ron jumped into their truck and drove to the nearest hospital to get my dad's wound treated. They reported the attack to the authorities. Both of them quit their jobs afterward. About 2 weeks later, while the rest of the logging crew was finishing up at the job site, one worker was found bound, gagged, murdered, and dumped into a ditch. As far as my dad knows, no one was ever caught for those crimes. To this day, my dad can barely see out of his right eye. His pupil is distorted, resembling a cat's eye more than a human's, and he suffers from severe PTSD from the event. He hasn't had a good night's sleep since that day. I'm a 31-year-old woman from Phoenix. 2 years ago, my partner and I, as we planned for years, hit 29, sold all our belongings, including my car, took his SUV, and set off to explore the US and Canada. You could call us adventurers because we often seek pleasant weather, find a national park, and hike into the wilderness for days at a time. My sister jokes that we're modern-day nomads. We're not totally off the grid, but between us, we share one prepaid phone, mostly for emergencies and staying in touch with family, and one laptop I use for work. I'm a freelance writer and content creator, mostly writing dull reports for a tech company. The main goal of our lifestyle is to live without debt and minimize bills. We use free Wi-Fi, so once or twice a week, we go into a city with a coffee shop to connect. We don't use social media much. We barely know how Reddit or Instagram work, and we avoid most apps. Last summer, we decided to do some hiking in Missouri. It's not a state many hikers talk about, but we read it had stunning landscapes, and it does. The park we chose had relaxed rules. We didn't need a permit, and there were just a few basic guidelines, no check-ins required. We were ready with all the essentials for a 6-day hike, 3 days in and 3 days out. Throughout the trip, we didn't encounter a single person. One evening, as we prepared to leave the trail and find a spot to camp before sunset, we saw a faint path, probably an animal trail, and followed it for about half a mile. That's when we stumbled upon a green 2-person tent, almost hidden in the foliage. Some hikers like their privacy. Others, like us, enjoy the social aspect of camping, swapping stories, or sharing meals. From about 30 yards away, my partner called out a greeting. No response, no movement. We assumed whoever was in the tent either wasn't around or didn't want to be disturbed, so we headed in a different direction to give them space. We didn't hear a peep. The next morning, we forgot all about the tent as we continued our hike. It wasn't until the 5th day on our way back that we came across the same tent again. This time, the tent flap was open. My partner called out again, but still no answer. He wanted to check it out, thinking something was wrong, but I wasn't keen on the idea. I'd heard enough stories from other hikers about reclusive folks who don't appreciate visitors, and some of them are armed. But my partner reassured me, saying we could always offer a peace offering like some food and move on. As we got closer, a horrific smell hit us, like something had died. My partner had been calling out as we approached, but when the stench reached him, he stopped and turned to me, asking, "What if we find a body?" My skin crawled. I had never seen a dead body before and didn't want to. The closer we got, the stronger the smell became, and I was sure we'd find a corpse. What we found was far worse. Outside the tent were severed animal legs, 4 of them, buzzing with flies. It looked like they had been cut partway, then torn off. Inside the tent was the rest of the deer, but the middle portion was wrapped in a blue blanket, soaked with blood. It was lying on its side, facing the tent opening. Its tail was missing, and its private areas were covered in dried blood, gaping as though something had been done to it. Its mouth was in the same state. The lower body was twisted at a disturbing angle. We could see all of this without going into the tent, which we wouldn't have done anyway because the smell was unbearable. Nearby was a nearly empty bottle of baby oil and a dirty kitchen towel. That was it. I started crying and begged my partner to leave. He just muttered, "What the?" We turned and ran back to the trail, jogging until it got too dark to continue. We didn't go far, but neither of us slept that night. We didn't light a fire or use any lights, even after it got completely dark. We just whispered to each other, going over what we had just seen, every little sound startling us. I kept imagining that whoever had done this would come back, find our tracks, and follow us. I had never been so terrified in my life. At the crack of dawn, we packed up and headed out. On the way out of the park, we stopped at the ranger station to report what we had found. The ranger, a guy about our age, looked visibly shaken as we told him the story. He took down the details, and my partner showed him on a map where the tent was located. The ranger asked if we knew how the deer had been killed, and it dawned on us that we hadn't even thought about it. We had assumed it had been shot, but with the blanket, we hadn't actually seen any wound. Since that experience, we've shortened our hikes to no more than 4 days, and we're much more cautious about approaching other campsites. We've also never gone near an unattended tent again. This story is about a troubling experience I had while camping by the ocean one summer with my partner. We had thought it would be a great idea to camp on the beach instead of staying at a hotel, since I had always wanted to sleep with the sound of waves crashing on the shore, gaze at the night sky, and live this experience at least once in my life. We planned to stay in the tent for about a week. The location had public restrooms with showers and food stands, so hygiene and meals weren't a concern. We brought everything we thought we'd need for the trip, like a small 2-person tent with blackout fabric so the sunlight wouldn't wake us early, an inflatable bed, a first aid kit, lanterns for inside the tent, and other essentials. The first few nights were without any problems, and we enjoyed every moment of it. We always carried our valuables in our backpacks, just in case something happened to our tent. We weren't the only ones camping in that spot either. There were plenty of others, individual campers, couples, and even families, but not everyone acted well. Some of the campers got loud at night with people partying, playing music, drinking too much, and even using drugs. We didn't mind since no one was causing any real trouble during the first few days. One night, we stayed out a bit later than usual, maybe around 1 a.m., walking through the lively streets, watching street performers, grabbing some food, and just enjoying the atmosphere. We stopped at one performer who had a crowd around him. It wasn't long before we realized the crowd wasn't watching him, though. In the middle of the street, where cars occasionally passed by, was a middle-aged woman dancing completely naked, clearly out of control from drinking and drug use. She wasn't making much sense, randomly flirting with people and exposing herself, much to the discomfort of the musician and the people passing by. We didn't stay long and decided to head back to our tent. While walking back, we heard some woman yelling in the distance. It was the same woman from earlier, but now she was with a group of friends, and they were heading to camp near us, just a few tents down. Though it was dark, we could still see them and hear them. They started a fire on the beach, drinking, smoking, and dancing around it. The woman was still naked, but had now put on a see-through skirt. She went into the ocean for what felt like ages, and I remember thinking how she wasn't freezing since the water was so cold. My boyfriend and I decided to just ignore them, as we didn't want to get involved. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us, though. Eventually, we tried to fall asleep. It was a warm night, so we didn't fully close the tent. Just zipped up the mosquito netting to let some air in while keeping the bugs out. I thought the morning sun would wake us up early. I'm not sure how long I had been asleep when I woke up to the sound of footsteps walking around our tent and a soft, female voice humming a tune. The tent wasn't very thick, so I could hear everything clearly. I was too scared to move or even look outside, afraid to let the person know I was awake. I just lay there, staring through the mosquito net. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped right above my head, and I heard a voice whisper, "Don't be scared. I just want to sing you a lullaby." The footsteps continued circling the tent. I saw her feet pass in front of the tent, and I noticed the familiar long, see-through skirt blowing in the breeze. The next morning, we packed up our things and moved our tent to a different spot on the beach, further away from that woman and her group. In the summer of 2009, something unforgettable happened. Growing up in Washington, I was no stranger to the outdoors, having loved it since childhood. My favorite activity was hiking, particularly in remote and dangerous areas. The health benefits were nice, but I was more drawn to the excitement of hiking near steep cliffs and knowing I was in areas with wild animals like cougars and bears, far from any help. After watching Into the Wild when it came out in 2008, I became obsessed. As a high school senior, I was ready to leave home, and the movie only fueled my desire for adventure. It inspired me to hike the Washington portion of the Pacific Crest Trail after I graduated. I started from the Mexican border, made it to Northern California without any major issues. Just some rattlesnakes, bears, and mild dehydration, but nothing too scary. One day, while hiking through Lassen National Forest in Northern California, I rounded a corner and was surprised to see two people sitting on a rock, dressed in mostly white. Their faces were dirty, and they looked unkempt. The man had a messy beard, and both seemed to be in their late 30s. Their appearance was startling, like something was off about them. What really struck me was that I hadn't seen anyone for days, and suddenly, here were these two people. I greeted them, but they didn't respond, just stared at me as I walked by. That night, I camped a short distance off the trail, following the usual precautions for bears by hanging my leftover food from a tree. The next morning, I noticed the food was gone. I initially thought it was a bear, but after looking around, I didn't find any bear tracks, just boot prints. Two sets of footprints circled my campsite, and one led directly to where my food had been hanging. My mind immediately went to the two strangers I had passed the day before. Realizing they might have taken my food, I packed up quickly and left, unsettled but telling myself they were probably just hungry. If they had wanted to harm me, they would have done more than take my food, right? A few days went by and I started to relax again. As a precaution, I began surrounding my campsite with sticks to wake me if anyone or anything approached. Then, one night, I woke up to the sound of those sticks cracking. Grabbing my knife, I tried to calm myself, thinking it was probably an animal. But then I heard whispering. It was hard to tell where the voices were coming from, and being deep in the forest, every sound played tricks on me. I considered shouting, pretending I had a weapon, but instead, I stayed quiet to keep the element of surprise. I could hear footsteps circling my tent, but suddenly, everything stopped. No more whispers, no more footsteps. I stayed awake until dawn, but when I finally emerged from my tent, there was no sign of anyone, except for more boot prints. Several days later, I was in Shasta National Forest, far from where I first encountered the strange couple. The trail had become narrow and rugged, and I could see miles of it stretching ahead and behind me. Stopping for water, I noticed two figures far off in the distance, just tiny dots on the trail behind me. Something clicked in my mind, and I thought, this is over. I immediately pulled out my map and found the nearest town, Castella, about 20 miles away. Determined to get there as fast as I could, I hiked late into the night, finally setting up camp far off the trail, hoping I wouldn't be found. I couldn't sleep, every little noise keeping me on edge. Then I heard the sounds again, the footsteps, the whispering, and sticks breaking. The sounds were much louder now, and I knew they were close. I thought, this is really happening. Suddenly, a flashlight lit up my tent, then quickly went dark. Grabbing my knife, I unzipped my tent and ran into the darkness, screaming nonsense to scare them off. I could hear footsteps coming toward me, and in the corner of my vision, I saw a figure moving. I ran deeper into the forest, tripping and falling several times before finally tumbling next to a fallen tree. I crawled underneath it and stayed completely still for hours. I could see the flashlight moving around in the distance, but eventually it disappeared. I stayed hidden until morning, when the birds started chirping. I made my way back to the trail, abandoning my campsite, and hiked to Costella. Once there, I hitchhiked to the nearby town of Mount Shasta and told the police and forest rangers everything. They were kind enough to put me up in a motel, and the next day my parents drove down to pick me up. Months later, I followed up with the authorities. They told me there had been other reports of stolen supplies in the area, but no one else had experienced anything like what I went through. As far as I know, they never caught that strange couple. Last summer, my partner and I went camping at a nature reserve somewhere in Virginia. I don't recall the exact name, but it was very remote, no cell service, and we only saw 2 other people the whole time. The place was vast and mostly deserted. Right away, my partner felt uneasy about those 2 people. I'm not sure if they had anything to do with what happened later, but I'll describe them. The first person was a woman who had her truck parked just off the trail with the hood popped open. I'm not someone who notices things like that, but my partner thought she looked like she was waiting for someone to stop and help her. Normally, he'd offer to call for assistance, but he said she made him feel uneasy, so he didn't want to engage. The second person was a man who kept driving by our campsite slowly while we were setting up. He passed by a couple of times, and though I hadn't paid much attention, my partner definitely noticed. But the strange part happened later that night. Around 3 a.m., we were jolted awake by a loud sound. I can't quite describe it or compare it to anything, but my partner said it was like the sound of a large machine starting up or a tool grinding gravel. He jumped up and looked out of the tent's small window, hearing the sound again and again, each time growing closer. I was terrified, but he assured me it was likely miles away, and I believed him. Loud noises do carry far, after all. However, later he admitted that he said that just to keep me calm. In truth, it sounded much closer to him, like it was right down the dirt road near our camp. He suspected at one point that whatever it was had come right in front of our site. He didn't tell me to run for the car because he feared it might be someone trying to scare us out of the tent for reasons unknown. He whispered for me to go back to sleep, but I couldn't. Every small sound outside made me think someone was creeping up on us. After a while, when the noises had stopped for about 20 minutes, he told me to help him pack up quickly. He held our only weapon, a machete, close by while we packed under the bright moonlight, so we didn't need a flashlight. While we were hurrying to gather our things, I noticed an empty beer can near the cold campfire. It hadn't been there when we went to sleep around 10 p.m., and neither of us had brought beer on the trip. Thankfully, we got out of there. For the rest of the trip, we either camped in places with more people around or stayed in hotels. Whoever or whatever caused that strange noise, I'm just glad it wasn't us they were after. It was the summer before my junior year of high school, and I'd been going to sleepaway camps for as long as I could remember. That summer was no different, though this time I was at a new kind of camp where we'd be hiking a section of the Appalachian Trail for 2 weeks instead of staying on the campgrounds. This was something completely new for me, but I was excited since I've always been the adventurous type. On this trip, it was me, 2 female leaders, and 9 other girls. A few days into the hike, we had started getting to know each other, but we were also already pretty comfortable together. We stopped for lunch near a spring, our spot being on the trail, but close to a section where a road passed by. While eating, we all noticed a van that looked like one of those old, sketchy types, driving back and forth along the road. No one said anything, but we all saw it. After a few minutes of the van passing, it finally pulled onto the trail, near where we were sitting. It just stayed there for a bit, and we assumed the driver was lost or looking for a restroom since nobody commented on it. Then, suddenly, a man got out of the van, ran over to us and started yelling, "Does anyone know CPR? My brother is having a seizure." Immediately, our two leaders rushed over to the van and disappeared for several minutes. Meanwhile, the rest of us started feeling uneasy. Someone mentioned, "Didn't that van drive by us a few times?" And others wondered why he would say "brother" in such an odd situation. When the leaders finally came back, they had blank expressions on their faces and wouldn't answer any of our questions. That's when the man returned, but this time holding some creepy puppets, like those plastic Halloween decorations people put on their porches, only without the candy. He tried talking to us, but no one responded. We just kept eating quietly. In an eerie voice, he said, "My puppet likes girls." He also claimed it could talk and pressed a button on its foot. After a while, he seemed to get the hint and went back to his van. He sat there for what felt like forever, with the door open and loud music blasting. Eventually, he drove off and we quickly packed up and left the area. Though it wasn't a terrifying experience, it was unsettling, and the day only got stranger. As we continued our hike, we talked about the odd man with the puppets for a while, then started telling scary stories until we reached our campsite. We arrived early, so we had a lot of daylight left. Being a group of teenage girls, we got bored fast and started wandering around. We flirted with some boys who were nearby, but they eventually lost interest and left. Afterward, we decided to play a game called Elephants and Gazelles, a game that works best with a big group. Conveniently, 3 guys approached us, introducing themselves, not the same boys we had been flirting with earlier. Since they seemed friendly, one of the girls invited them to join our game. That's when things got weird. During the breaks, people shared personal stories to get to know each other better, even though us girls had already been chatting nonstop for days. Out of the blue, one of the guys announced that 2 of them were trans. Now, I have no issue with people living their truth, but it just felt strange that it was mentioned out of nowhere, given we barely knew them. They went on to talk about how they were trying to start a reality show about 3 trans men living in New York, with the 3rd member of their group, who wasn't trans, pretending to be part of the show. Again, I didn't think anything was wrong with them being trans. It was just odd how they brought it up. Later, they were whispering among themselves and started laughing loudly. One of them shouted, "That's funny because your dad's in jail." At this point, we were all feeling a little uncomfortable. Trying to break the tension, one of the girls told them about the strange man with the puppets we'd met earlier. To our shock, they laughed and said that was their uncle, who had dropped them off earlier in the day. Not long after, they said they were tired and headed back to their tent, much to our relief. That evening, a few girls went to the bathroom and walked past their tent on the way. They later said they heard them singing Justin Timberlake songs, and on their way back, they overheard one of the guys shout, "Tickle fight!" It rained heavily that night, and when we woke up the next morning, their tent was gone. We were surprised since we usually got up early. Just before we left, I found a folded piece of paper on a tree stump near our tent. It read, "We got soaked in the rain and had to leave. We'll miss all of you and the great friendships we made. Heart. The weird guys who get no respect." I'm still not sure what was stranger, that they told us all those random things or that they were somehow related to the creepy puppet man. Three years ago, in Los Angeles, my partner and I, after planning for 5 years, both turned 29. We sold everything we had, including my car, and packed up his SUV, setting out to travel across the US and Canada. We could be described as wandering adventurers, as we often chase good weather and camp in state parks or hike deep into the wilderness for a few days at a time. My brother jokes that we're modern-day nomads. We don't live entirely off-grid, but between the two of us, we share one prepaid phone for emergencies and checking in with family, and I use a laptop for work. I'm a freelance writer and content creator, primarily writing technical papers and web content for a robotics company. Our goal is to live with minimal debt and keep our expenses low. I only use free Wi-Fi, so once or twice a week, we head to a city with a coffee shop for work. This background helps explain how simply we live. We're not into social media and don't know much about apps like Instagram. Last summer, we decided to explore the wilderness of Arkansas, a state not commonly visited by other hikers, though we had read that it has stunning landscapes. The park we visited had relaxed rules. We didn't need a permit, just had to follow a few basic guidelines, but no official check-in was required. We had all our gear and planned a 6-day hike, 3 days in and 3 days out. During our trek, we didn't see or hear another person. On one evening, as we prepared to find a campsite off the trail before dusk, we followed what looked like an animal path. About half a mile out, we came across a small green tent, nearly hidden in the foliage. We almost stumbled upon it by accident. Some hikers prefer privacy, while others are more social, like us. We've had great experiences camping near other travelers, sharing stories and food. About 30 yards from the tent, the flap was closed, so my partner called out to announce our presence. There was no response, no movement. We assumed the occupant wasn't around or didn't want to be disturbed, so we moved on to find our own campsite. We set up, camped through the night, and heard nothing unusual. By the next day, we had almost forgotten about the green tent until we saw it again on day 5 as we neared the end of our hike. It's not uncommon to encounter the same campsite, but most hikers keep moving, so we didn't expect to see it. This time, the tent flap was open. My partner called out again, but there was still no response. My partner wanted to check it out, thinking someone might be injured. I was uneasy from the start. While we've never had bad experiences, we've heard stories about reclusive individuals who don't want company and might be armed. But my partner assured me it would be fine, and if necessary, we could offer peace in the form of a small gift and move on. As we got closer, the smell hit us. It was the unmistakable stench of decay. My partner, who had been calling out, stopped when he smelled it too. He turned to me and said, "What if there's a body?" My skin crawled. I had never seen a body before, and I didn't want to start now. The closer we got, the stronger the odor became. I was certain we were about to find a dead person inside. What we found was worse. Outside the tent was a dead deer. Its legs were swarmed with flies, and it looked like they had been partially cut and then ripped off. It was a gruesome sight. Inside the tent was the deer's body and head, with the middle part wrapped in a blood-soaked blue blanket. The deer was lying on its side, with its tail cut off and its private areas covered in dried blood, as if something had violated it. The same was true for its mouth, which was twisted at a disturbing angle. The tent was open, so we could see everything without stepping inside. Not that we would have anyway. The smell was overwhelming. There was an almost empty bottle of baby oil and a stained kitchen towel. That was it. I broke down in tears and begged my partner to leave. He could only manage a "what the hell" before we turned and ran back to the trail. We kept moving until dusk, setting up camp much closer to the trail than usual. Neither of us slept that night. We didn't light a fire or use headlamps, sitting in the dark and whispering to each other, going over what we had just seen. Every noise made us jump. I kept imagining the person responsible for the scene tracking us down at dawn. We packed up and left, stopping at the ranger station to report what we had found. The ranger, a young guy around our age, looked just as horrified as we felt. He took notes while we pointed out the location on a map. When he asked if we knew how the deer had been killed, we realized we hadn't even considered that. We had assumed it had been shot, but there were no visible wounds. Since then, we've shortened our backcountry hikes and are much less eager to call out to other campsites. And we've never approached another abandoned tent again. About 6 years ago, I was around 11 and my brother was 25. At the time, my brother had been serving in the military for several years and was getting ready to go on his second deployment to the Middle East. He had recently finished his Special Forces training and was a qualified Special Forces engineer. My brother wasn't someone to mess with. Since we both loved the outdoors, he thought it would be nice to take me on a hiking trip before his 9-month deployment. We decided to head to a remote wilderness area in northern Mississippi for the trip. Everything was going smoothly until the third night. Around 8 p.m., we were sitting by our campfire after dinner, talking about random stuff like guns and things. Our campsite was about 50 yards from a stream and roughly the same distance from a trail, forming a rough triangle between the stream, the trail, and our camp. It was summer, so it wasn't completely dark yet when 2 guys who looked to be in their late 20s showed up. They asked if we'd seen any wild hogs while hiking. We had, so we told them. They were polite enough, but something about them made me feel uneasy. They had scruffy facial hair, dirty clothes, and greasy hair. My brother called them good old boys, but they looked like they'd come straight out of a backwoods horror movie. They lingered a little longer than necessary, asking how long we'd been camping and how much longer we were staying. I got the sense they were sizing us up. They eventually left, but the whole encounter left me feeling uneasy. My brother didn't seem worried, though a few hours later, I woke up to the sound of dogs barking. I've always been a heavy sleeper, but they sounded close, maybe 100 yards away. My heart was pounding, so I kicked my brother to wake him up. He whispered, "I'm awake. They've been getting closer for about an hour. Stay still and be quiet." At this point, I was scared out of my mind. We could hear occasional shouts from different directions, but they didn't seem to be coming closer. After a few minutes, my brother whispered that they were probably hunting hogs using dogs. That gave me a little relief, but I was still uneasy. Somehow, I managed to fall back asleep. I woke up again a few hours later, around 2 a.m., to my brother shaking me awake. He told me to quietly put on my shoes and follow him. I could still hear the dogs barking, but they were farther away. Without asking any questions, I did as he said. He had me climb on his back, and we moved about 50 yards into the woods, towards where the trail met the stream and hid in some bushes. From our position on a hill, we had a clear view of our campsite. My brother pulled out his pistol, an HK, and kept watch while I tried to stay quiet. A group of 5 men, accompanied by 3 or 4 dogs, arrived at our camp. 2 of the men had guns, either rifles or shotguns. The dogs were going crazy, clearly having caught our scent. At this point, I was terrified. My brother later told me they were talking about us, but he couldn't make out what they were saying. They hung around our camp for about 20 minutes, shining flashlights around. My brother whispered to me, "If they come this way, run. Don't stop, don't look back, and stay off the trail." He handed me a flashlight with a red filter, telling me to keep it on to preserve my night vision. That as we lay there, I felt a mix of fear and adrenaline. I was scared, but my brother's calmness gave me some confidence. Suddenly, the men started yelling and firing their guns into the woods. My brother pulled me behind the hill, protecting me from the gunfire. After a few more shots, they began walking away. A few minutes later, we heard sirens and saw flashing lights. It turned out that while I was asleep earlier, my brother had called for help using a satellite phone our family kept for emergencies. Forest rangers and game wardens arrived, and the men quickly fled. My brother signaled to the rangers, who chased after the men. Once the danger had passed, we packed up our campsite and waited for the game wardens to return. They gave us a ride back to the main staging area in their truck. On the way back, my brother told me how brave I'd been and asked if I wanted to tell our parents what had happened. I asked him not to because I didn't want them to stop letting me go camping. My family has owned a cabin in the Shasta National Forest for generations, and my sister and I always spent our summers there. It's stunning, especially for those of us who grew up in dry West Texas. The forest is lush, the mountain air cool, and it was always a much-needed break from the heat and dust of our ranch. My dad, an ex-military man, made sure we were well-trained in outdoor survival skills. We fished, hunted, camped, and hiked often. What was fun for us probably felt like a mission for him to prepare us. We would spend weeks during summer hiking the trails, exploring old cabins, and visiting remnants of the past like an old water project that diverted water for the nearby river back in the late 1800s. It's a beautiful place, full of wildlife and with high mountain lakes that shimmer in the sun. This particular event took place when I was in college, and my younger sister was still in high school. My dad, tied up with work, would come up periodically to visit us while we stayed with our mom, who spent most of her time in town painting or relaxing around the cabin. It was late June, maybe early July, when we decided to hike up to Hidden Lake, one of my favorite spots. When you see the lake from a certain angle, it looks like a heart. We were well prepared for the hike that day with small packs, water, snacks, and hammocks. The plan was to set up the hammocks by the lake and just relax. I'm definitely an outdoor type and swear that if you're quiet enough, you can hear the trees speak. My dad had always made sure we carried knives while hiking just in case. Since our family cabin was already far into the valley, we set off on foot towards the trailhead. To reach Hidden Lake, you have to follow another trail to Fork Lake and then veer off. We passed a few other hikers heading to Fork Lake, but it seemed like Hidden Lake would be ours alone. The trail was steep and winding, but the payoff at the top was worth it. The lake was pristine, shimmering in emerald green. We were alone. We walked around the lake before heading into the tree line to find a good spot to hang our hammocks. As we entered the trees, my sister suddenly said, "Do you smell that?" I did. It was the strong scent of blood, unmistakable from our hunting experience. We soon found the source, a deer carcass, but it wasn't just the carcass that disturbed us. Its organs had been placed in a circle around it, with small piles of rocks in between. It wasn't just a butchered animal. It felt like some sort of ritual arrangement. My sister was about to call my name when we both saw him. He was standing about 20 feet away, half hidden by the trees, covered in blood with hardly any clothes on. It looked like he had just crawled out of the deer. He didn't speak or move, just stared at us, his eyes wide and wild. My dad had always taught us to take control of any situation where we felt threatened, so I did what I could to surprise him. "Nice kill," I said. "Did you use a bow?" He didn't answer. He just stood there, staring. My sister was ready to run, and I could feel the tension in her. I placed my hand on my knife, not to attack, but to show him I wasn't defenseless. I kept eye contact with him the whole time, trying to project confidence. He seemed like he was in his early 30s, though it was hard to tell under all the dirt and blood. I stepped back slowly, signaling my sister to follow. She moved behind me as I asked again, "Good hunting day?" He remained silent, like a statue, not moving an inch. We edged back toward the lake and started to make our way around it, quickening our pace. My sister was visibly shaken, and I was mostly angry. How dare he ruin this place we loved so much? As we reached the trailhead, I scanned the tree line, half expecting him to follow, but he didn't. We picked up our pace, almost jogging down the trail, not speaking about what had just happened. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I kept glancing back, but there was no sign of him until the first pebble hit us. Someone was throwing rocks at us, and it could only be him. My sister sped up, almost running now, but I was furious. I yelled back, telling him to go back to his deer and leave us alone. The pebbles stopped, but then we started hearing growling and barking noises. My sister said, "Is he growling at us?" I told her to ignore it and keep moving. He followed us the whole way, growling and making strange noises, but never showing himself. As we neared the point where our trail joined the Fork Lake Trail, he finally seemed to back off. We didn't stop until we were well down the trail, and even then, my sister refused to look back. As we talked about what happened, she insisted that he was dangerous, and we had been in real danger. I thought he was just some crazy guy trying to scare two girls. When we told our parents, my dad didn't like what he heard. He taught us more self-defense after that and forbade us from hiking alone ever again. We didn't hike that trail for years after the incident. The forest, my sanctuary, had felt unsafe for the first time in my life. I didn't know then, but when we got back, my mom had called some neighbors. A few men hiked up to check the area the next day. They found the deer carcass and some empty hiking packs near a campsite further into the woods, but no sign of the man. The Appalachian Trail is a well-known hiking route with a strong community surrounding it. People often come together at popular camping spots where there's food, drinks, and good company. In fact, one of my other friends met his partner while hiking alone on the trail. Knowing how friendly the trail community was, my friend thought she would be safe on her own journey. For the first few nights, she camped with different groups of people she met along the way, and everything was fine. They shared stories, food, drinks, and enjoyed typical camping activities like making s'mores. On the fourth night, she decided to camp alone for the first time. Although she felt a little uneasy, she brushed it off as nerves after having such a good time with others earlier. For the next few nights, she continued camping by herself, but each night, the feeling of nervousness grew stronger. She began to sense that something or someone was watching her. To make matters worse, she noticed that some of her belongings weren't exactly where she had left them the night before, although she wasn't sure if she was just imagining it. The feeling became so intense that she decided to join other campers again for the next couple of nights, feeling somewhat foolish for her fear. However, after a few days of camping with others, she tried solo camping again. But the unsettling feeling returned, stronger than ever. It became so overwhelming that she decided to abandon her plan of completing the trail solo. She made up an excuse about spraining her ankle and returned home, feeling embarrassed for letting a mere feeling make her quit. A few weeks later, she was feeling nostalgic and decided to go through the photos from her trip on her digital camera, which she hadn't touched since she got back. She scrolled through pictures of the scenery and the people she had met. But then, she came across a strange photo, one of her sleeping in her tent, taken from inside. At first, she thought maybe someone she met along the way had taken her camera as a joke and snapped the picture. But as she continued flipping through the photos, she found more photos of her sleeping at campsites where she was completely alone. There were pictures from each night she camped alone, all of her asleep in her tent. Needless to say, she gave up on her dream of solo hiking after that discovery. A few weeks ago, my girlfriend Sarah and I decided to take a spontaneous hike on a trail we found near Santa Monica. We originally planned to go hiking at another spot, but traffic made it too far to reach, so we settled on this closer one after finding it on Yelp. Once we found the trailhead, we began our hike to a barely there waterfall because California had been experiencing a drought. While hiking, we passed by 3 guys, 2 of them shirtless and muddy, who greeted us. After they passed, Sarah joked that they seemed sketchy and probably up to no good. To ease her mind, I handed her my spare knife, which I always carry for safety. After we reached the waterfall and started heading back, We heard the sound of leaves crunching and being stomped on aggressively from the direction of a ravine next to the trail. We stopped and turned to check where the noise was coming from. I suggested that maybe a tree was about to fall since there were a few with exposed roots nearby. Sarah quickly responded, "That doesn't sound like a tree falling, Mike." The rustling sound grew louder and more frequent, as if something was rapidly getting closer and making its way up the ravine toward us. When I saw some tall plants shaking nearby, I yelled at Sarah to run. We both started sprinting, with whatever was making the noise seemingly chasing us from the ravine. At one point, it even felt like it was trying to cut us off from the only way out of the trail. During the run, I realized Sarah should be in front because she's a faster sprinter while I'm more of a distance runner. I quickly grabbed her arm, pulled her ahead of me, and told her to keep going. As we ran, I couldn't help but glance back, like in those horror movies where people always look behind them. Bad idea. When I turned, I saw a bush taller than me. I'm 5 feet 5 inches, moving aggressively. That freaked me out, and I ran even faster. In my panic, I missed seeing a dip in the trail and ended up injuring my recently healed ankle. It slowed me down a bit, but Sarah slowed down with me. I told her to keep going. After some distance, we finally stopped to catch our breath, drink some water, and try to make sense of what just happened. I told Sarah to take out the knife I gave her while I pulled out my small pocket knife. We discussed what we'd do if the noise came closer, agreeing that she should stay ahead since she could run faster, and I would hold off whatever it was if needed. Thanks to my martial arts background, as we continued walking the trail, I tried to lighten the mood by joking. "See? This is where your sprinter genes come in handy." Just as I said that, the rustling noise started again. We both sprinted as fast as we could away from whatever was still pursuing us. The funny part was when, up ahead, we saw 2 more hikers. Sarah quickly put her knife away, while I was behind her, awkwardly holding my tiny pocket knife, yelling at her to stop so I could hide it. I didn't want to look like some crazy person chasing her with a knife. Eventually, we saw more people with their dogs heading toward the waterfall, and we felt safer. Once we made it back to the street, we drank more water and tried to figure out what had happened. Sarah thought maybe one of the guys we passed earlier had hidden in the ravine to scare us. To this day, we're still unsure what it was. The closest guess we had was that it might have been a coyote, especially after reading that one had been spotted in the area a few months back. But I don't fully believe it was a coyote. It moved too fast and seemed too large. I just told Sarah it could have been one to calm her down since she gets scared by things like that. Whatever it was, it definitely gave us a good scare as we hurried off that trail. A few years back, I went on a hike in the Blue Ridge Mountains. It was supposed to be a simple day hike with 2 of my buddies. As we got into the first day, one of them started feeling sick and decided to head back. My other friend went with him, just in case things got worse. They told me to keep going, so I did, since I'd been looking forward to the hike for a long time. As evening started to fall, I came across a small open area in the woods. In the middle of it was a table covered in tools and cans of spray paint. On top of the table was an elaborate dollhouse, about 3 feet tall. Its windows and walls were wide open, as if it had just been painted and was drying. The smell of fresh spray paint still lingered in the air around it. On the back of the house, there was a photo stuck to it, a family picture that looked like it was from the 80s. Everyone in the photo had a strange, uncomfortable expression, like they didn't want to be there or were forced to pose. They didn't look scared, just uneasy. I left the dollhouse and kept going, wanting to reach my campsite before nightfall. The wind was picking up, and in the distance, I heard a branch snap and fall to the ground, which startled me. I found my campsite but couldn't shake the uneasy feeling about that dollhouse in the middle of nowhere. I decided not to camp out in the open, in case whoever was working on it came by. I had a small 1-person tent, just big enough for me to lie down in. I set it up behind some thick bushes, with one side blocked by a tall row of rocks. I felt glad for the cover, not only because I was hidden, but also because the rocks helped block the cold wind that was blowing down from the mountains. That night, the sound of the wind through the trees was actually pretty calming, and I think I fell asleep right away. At some point, I woke up with a jolt, not sure why, but with the faint echo of a sound lingering in my head. I lay there in the dark, and suddenly I had the feeling that someone was nearby. I listened carefully, trying to hear over the wind. After a moment, I heard a man's voice in the distance. It was harsh and rapid at first, then got softer. He was too far away for me to understand what he was saying, but close enough that I could hear the tone and rhythm of his voice. He sounded like he was talking to himself, scolding himself even. Then, his voice got louder, and I could hear his footsteps crashing through the brush, coming straight towards me. He passed just a few feet away from where I was hiding. By this time, my eyes had adjusted a little to the moonlight, but I couldn't see much, just a big, bulky figure. Maybe around 6 feet 6 inches and heavy set. He was carrying something long under his arm, probably a rolled up tent. He was muttering about someone's face haunting him, and then, strangely, his tone changed. He started talking in a childlike voice about cheese and crackers. The guy was clearly not in his right mind. After a while, he kept walking, his voice fading as he moved further away, and eventually I couldn't hear him anymore. I barely slept the rest of the night. As soon as the sun came up, I packed up my things and hiked back to town as fast as I could. When I passed through the clearing again, the dollhouse was gone. This all happened a few years ago, but it still gives me chills thinking about it. About 8 months ago, my partner and I had just gotten a new 7-month-old boxer pup to keep our 4-year-old Labrador company. We thought it would be fun to take them on a walk in the countryside. We live near a big city called York in northern England and decided to walk in a rural area north of a river that flows into the sea. After reaching a small village near a local World War II fort, we chose to walk around and through the small wooded patches near a nature reserve. As we walked along a grassy hill towards the woods, my partner noticed 2 young men approaching from the woods, walking diagonally as if they were trying to intercept us. I wondered if they were involved in a World War II reenactment because they were both wearing camo pants and covered in dirt. At first, I didn't think much of them, assuming they just passed by, but as they came closer, it was clear they were heading straight for us. They stopped about 10 feet away and one of them spoke, but the way he talked still unsettles me. It was rude and almost nonsensical. He asked where we were heading, and we told him we weren't sure, just exploring. He seemed disappointed and suggested we take his route through the woods, claiming it led to a nice spot with benches for resting. While he talked, the other guy kept a close eye on our dogs, almost as if he didn't want to lose sight of them. Since we didn't know much about the area and hadn't seen anyone else around, we followed his suggestion. They pointed to an opening in the woods, and we continued walking. The woods were thick, blocking out about 1/3 of the sunlight, and as I glanced back, I saw the 2 men hadn't left but were watching us walk away. The path through the woods seemed man-made, as it was the only clear trail. About 2 minutes in, our Labrador started sniffing around a bush, which wasn't unusual since the dogs loved exploring. But then she began sniffing one spot intensely and rolled on the ground. When we went to check on her, we saw she was sniffing at a torn-up rubber pig mask smeared with some dark red liquid. It looked gross, and my partner quickly pulled the dog away, noticing flies buzzing around it. As we continued, the woods narrowed into a long, overgrown path. We could see a bend up ahead and agreed to turn back if it didn't lead anywhere. I walked ahead, preparing to snap a picture on my phone, when suddenly I felt several sharp stings on my neck, chin, and face. I gasped, and my partner rushed over, telling me to stay still. Carefully, he pulled thin wires away from my face. It turned out someone had strung fishing hooks along the path. We were both scared, confused, and furious. We rushed back to the car and drove home, still shaken. I don't want to sound paranoid, but as we drove away, I could have sworn I saw something in the rearview mirror peeking out from the woods.